I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar on Nutrition Basics. My name is Rachel Wyman, and I'm a registered dietitian here at Mission Weight Management Center. I'm so excited to share this topic with you because I am aware of the plethora of nutrition information about food and diets in our media, in magazines, on TV, and I hope you can really use this webinar as an opportunity to hopefully clear away some of the cobwebs out there and learn some evidence-based and factual information that hopefully will help you to feel more comfortable about our nutritional approach here. So sometimes we can easily label food as the enemy when we're trying to lose weight, tackle our weight. Sometimes we can choose food as our friend. Sometimes we view it as the enemy. Sometimes we have almost a love-hate relationship with food, unfortunately. So sometimes this distorted relationship can trigger us to eat for reasons other than hunger. Some of these reasons we're going to list here up above. It could be social reasons. Sometimes at holidays we're choosing to eat. Sometimes out of boredom throughout the day, often as a mode of celebrating life events. Sometimes when we're encountering stress, we're prone to stress eating, triggered by cravings for particular tastes or textures of foods. And sometimes truly it is based on our nutritional needs throughout the day. Take a moment though to think about your triggers. Think about times in the day when you think you find yourself eating mindlessly or emotionally. And how do you feel about this? How would you feel to view food differently? How would it feel to view food through a healthier lens? And I just want to take a side note here to mention that the behavioral staff here would be more than happy to work specifically with you on any of these eating triggers that apply specifically to you. Sometimes having a one-on-one session to address these can be really, really beneficial. So I'd like to invite you to consider that as you move along through our program. So let's look at some things, how we might view food when we're encountering it. This might be what our eyes see. For example, if we think of that eating trigger around the holidays, so we might be seeing pie, we might be seeing the family member who made it for us, thought it was our favorite food, and just kind of that whole holiday gathering. There can be a lot of memories and emotions and things that we associate with particular foods. However, ultimately, though, what our body sees is different. When we eat food, our body is recognizing molecules and nutrients that the food provides in our body. So sugar and different types of fats and calories. And so really it can be really helpful to think about food more accurately for what it truly is just a simple combination of nutrients. So today's objectives here for class will be discussing the importance of understanding the nutrient composition of foods, identifying the primary macronutrients in our diet as well as their functions and purposes, what they can do for us, describe the appropriate distribution of macronutrients at eating occasions and throughout the day, so we really know how to actually take this information and apply it to real life, and identify the micronutrients in our diets, define resting energy expenditure, and explain its role in metabolism and weight loss, and identify the role that meal replacements can play in weight management and the appropriate balance of nutrients to look for. And finally, we are going to touch upon some strategies and tips for meal planning and really putting all of this information to work for us. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is a little bit of food chemistry here, but hang in there because we're going to really break our nutrients down for food into more specific classes and components. The first we're going to talk about are macronutrients. And the word macro just means large. So it essentially just means the food that the type of nutrients that our body requires in larger doses through the day. There are, sometimes we can talk though in these amounts in grams versus milligrams. Usually the macronutrients, we're talking more in terms of grams in weight rather than milligrams. But nutrients that are macronutrients give our body calories and give us energy through the day. There are really three major primary macronutrients, the first being carbohydrates, which are giving us 4 calories per gram in weight. Then protein, which is giving us 4 calories per gram of weight. And finally, fats are giving us 9 calories per gram of weight. These are really the three primary nutrients. There is alcohol. Of course, that isn't essential. But these foods provide our calories in the form of these three nutrients. So we'll start by talking about carbohydrates, which are giving us, again, the 4 calories per gram. Our main function for carbohydrates and eating them is energy. Carbohydrates are really our body's preferred fuel source, and especially our brain. So especially when someone chooses to exclude carbohydrates from their diet or minimize them, maybe they're lacking in carbohydrates, we really can encounter a lot of mood disturbances and challenges with that, and so on concentration and focus through the day. So it's really vital that we supply our body with an appropriate amount of carbohydrates. So when we eat carbohydrates, they're broken ultimately down into glucose, which is a simplest form of carbohydrate that we can consume. And after that, once it gets absorbed in our body, then it can be either used immediately for energy. Some of it may be stored away in our liver and muscle tissue called glycogen. And other times, the glucose can be converted into fat and stored in our body fat cells, especially when we take in excessive amounts at one time of carbohydrate. So this is just a diagram of the process of intaking carbohydrate and absorbing it, and then where does ultimately that glucose end up in our body here. So sometimes carbohydrates get labeled as bad foods, and depending on any various popular diet plan out there, carbohydrates can get a pretty negative connotation to them. And people think that when they eat a carb food that they're going to be automatically gaining weight. But it's important for us to really distinguish that not all carbs are really the same. And essentially, when we eat too many of any nutrient, we're taking in excess calories that can cause weight gain. So it's possible to gain weight by overeating a variety of foods or food groups, not just carbohydrate foods. We just want to kind of clear that up. The other thing I'll point you out to is at the bottom of these slides. Some of them will have corresponding page numbers to a booklet that we give you at your first individual nutrition visit with the dietitian called your Choose Your Foods book. So if you have that book right now, you can actually take it and open it up to these pages as we talk about each nutrient and follow along, so you're able to really see some real examples of different foods in these categories. So the first category we're talking about are all the carbohydrate foods, which are on page 12 to 25. So feel free to flip to that or backtrack when you get that book. So when we talk about carbohydrates, we're going to be talking about examples first of these. What are some real food sources of carbohydrates? Sometimes we can associate carbs with pasta and rice and bread and potatoes, all of the white starchy things. And these are just one type of carb though. They're the starch group. There are carbohydrates in fruit though and in vegetables. And often we don't always think like that, but it's true. We're getting complex carbohydrates from these other foods as well. And it is possible for someone with eating the correct amount through the day to obtain all of the carbohydrates needed just from fruits and vegetables. So if that's a choice that you've made, your dietitian can work with you one-on-one on mapping that out and knowing that in more detail. But if someone chooses not to eat starches for various reasons, then we can plan accordingly. But then there are other more healthy choices for starches too that we'll talk about in a little bit. But starches sometimes are broken down a little bit more rapidly in the body, and so they can be a little bit less filling at meal times. Potentially, you get a little less volume of them too. They kind of cook down to about a third to a half a cup, which is not a very big serving size on the plate. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. Whereas these other carbohydrate foods from fruits and vegetables, you are getting a larger serving size from. And so that can be a strategy we can use when you're feeling more hungry. We can shift more of the carb sources to vegetables, things that you get a little bit more of a volume from. So breaking down the carbohydrates even further, there are simple carbohydrates that get absorbed very rapidly, and really we don't obtain a lot of sense of fullness from them. We call that satiety. We can consume a lot more of them at one time, and our blood sugar responds more rapidly when we take these things in, and so that can impact your weight management and your health. Whereas complex carbohydrate foods such as whole grains, high fiber starchy vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, and fruit, they all have more complexity to them, and they take longer to digest, and they absorb more slowly. So this really helps your blood sugar control, and we also get some fiber with these foods, which has some added health benefits to it with your digestive system, your gut, your heart health, lots of areas of your body that do well with more fiber to them. So just for remembering that not all carbs are created equally, we're leaning on the more complex carbs throughout the day. So we're going to show you some graphs here, some diagrams, comparing the differences when we eat more simple, refined carbohydrates versus when we eat the more complex forms of carbohydrate. So on this side, on the left-hand side, we're looking at, say, eating a very simple carbohydrate meal. Let's imagine, for example, we're eating a piece of white flour toast and some jam on there. So that's mostly sugar, very processed carbohydrate. We'd call it pretty simple. When you eat that for breakfast, your body is breaking it down pretty quickly. Even within an hour, at any given time, you might be hungry again after you get an initial surge of energy. All of a sudden, after all of that glucose has been shuttled away by your insulin to where it needs to go, then you find that you're hungry again and you're crashing. Versus if we shift the breakfast to something potentially with more complex carbohydrates, maybe we switch to even just whole grain, multigrain, high fiber toast. Instead of just jam, maybe we shift that to a whole piece of fruit on the side with it, maybe some berries, maybe an orange. There's a little bit more fiber in those foods as well, and so they're breaking down a lot more slowly, and they're lasting you quite a bit longer for energy and for appetite control. So from a weight management perspective, this is why it's important to minimize simple carbohydrates in favor of complex carbohydrates. So the other factors that can affect your blood sugar control sometimes are the timing of when you're eating, how far apart your meals are. If they're really far apart, you can feel a stronger sense of craving or hunger, and making it difficult to make better choices with food. And then also when you eat carbohydrates with other nutrients, which we'll talk more about, when you eat them together, you're getting even more sustained energy and more level digestion. So that's what we're going to be working on. And blood sugar control, it keeps hunger at bay. It does affect your metabolism, which is the rate that you're able to burn your energy from food. And it can also decrease the cravings and the desire for off-plan eating. So just to kind of wrap the carbohydrate part up here, really just remembering the goal is to get your carbohydrates primarily from whole food sources, such as vegetables, fruit, healthy starches. These might include beans, legumes, starchy vegetables like sweet potato, whole grains. Whole grains might include things like brown rice, wild rice, quinoa, barley, oats. There's a lot of options, and the more whole food you're having, the more that you're going to feel a sense of fullness, and the slower digestion will occur, and just the more appetite control you'll have. So the next macronutrient we're talking about is protein. So protein, just like carbohydrate, is going to be giving us 4 calories per gram in weight. Some functions of proteins. First of all, they're like a building block for all of our tissues of our body, our hormones, our enzymes, which are little chemical messengers that travel through our body and help with things like metabolism and breaking substances down. So all of our organs are essentially made of protein, including our muscles, so maintaining our lean body mass during rapid weight loss. Really, lean body mass is what burns most of our calories through the day at rest. So that's why it's so vital when we're losing weight to really preserve that lean body mass as we're losing. Also, protein helps with something called satiety. So really what that is during a meal, towards the end of a meal, getting a sense of satisfaction or fullness, that you've really reached the point in the meal where you got what you needed out of it and you don't feel like you really have to continue eating. That's different than feeling stuffed or stretched or too full. Just that mild feeling of fullness is what we're looking for. But with protein, with all good things, more is not always better. Too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So what we're really looking for is just an appropriate amount of protein at every meal and snack. Evenly distributing your protein throughout the day is much, much better on the body than going all day without any protein and then just having one big serving of protein at dinner. That's something we're going to try to shift away from for some of you. So smaller, more frequent meals are important to include. Ideally, we're not looking for more than 30 grams of protein at one given time. Excessive protein beyond that is not as usable for some of the more beneficial processes that protein is used for, and it's essentially going to be a excess calorie source converted into body fat. But converting all of this protein can put a stress on your kidneys, and we want to keep those healthy. They're able to filter out toxins and wastes from the body. So we want to keep your kidney health on par. And so it's important to work with your dietitian one-on-one just to determine what an appropriate day's worth of protein intake would be appropriate for you. Everyone's going to need a slightly different amount of protein by the end of their day. So we're going to work with you on that. But sources of some healthy sources of the protein, of course, so would be lean meats, so meats without a lot of extra fat incorporated in. There will be low-fat dairy products, reduced fat cheese, low-fat or skim milk, low-fat or fat-free Greek yogurt. Eggs would be another protein source that's whole food based. And then there are also many plant-based protein foods. A lot of them, the richest sources of plant protein are derived from soybeans, so things such as tofu or tempeh. So if that's something that's of interest to you as well, your dietitian can really work with you on the plant protein piece. So thinking about protein a little bit more detail, like we said, that carbohydrates get broken down into glucose, proteins get broken down into amino acids. These are like letters of an alphabet, if you think about it. When you put different letters together, they form different words or different sequences, like beads on a chain, and they can function all differently in these different combinations. And so some of the letters or amino acids our body can make by itself, and then others are essential, meaning we cannot make them on our own. We actually have to get them from the food that we're eating. And so that's what we're really talking about with amino acids and essential versus non-essential. So really thinking about that. Animal-based proteins are more efficient to utilize than plant proteins are, meaning that absorption of them is a little bit more complete. Not to say, though, that we can't plan out a meal plan centered solely around plant protein if that's something that someone is looking for. But depending on your dietary needs, animal-based proteins can be a good option too. So the third and last macronutrient we talk about are fats, which provide us with 9 calories per gram. This is the most calorie dense of all macronutrients. If you notice, it has the highest calories per gram in there. We do need some fat, though. It does have its place. It helps us absorb our fat-soluble vitamins, and it's used in the outer layer of our cells, which are little almost Lego blocks in our body put together. And also, some stored fat, body fat, is essential to insulate, protecting our vital organs, just help regulate our body's temperature. So when we consume fat, some of it can be stored in our body fat cells, and it can also be converted into an energy source as well. So with macronutrients and types of fats in particular, there are healthier types of fats, and then there are less healthy types. Just like we talked about carbohydrates being the healthiest being complex versus simple. Well, with fat, the healthiest forms would come from plant-based sources. These are these types that are monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats are called, versus saturated. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature. They come from animals. The examples would, of course, be things like bacon, the marbling of a piece of steak, and butter. These would be things we're trying to minimize because they promote heart disease, unfortunately. So just remembering that we want to be aware of how many calories we're taking in a weight management setting, and so all of these macronutrients will provide us with our calories. The image on your screen of a paperclip is the weight of 1 gram. So when we talk about 1 gram of protein or 1 gram of carb, sometimes it's helpful to have a visual with that. And so a paperclip is the same, the weight of what 1 gram is, what we're talking about there. Another macronutrient, though, that does not provide us with any calories, but is just as important, if not more so, is water. And so staying hydrated is very, very vital in doing things such as carrying nutrients and oxygen to the cells of our body, regulating our body temperature, helping prevent constipation, especially when we're making diet changes, and lubricating joints. When we're dehydrated, sometimes also we're mistaking that for extra hunger, so we're snacking more, and so making sure every day you're keeping up with your hydration goals can be really important. The last thing is to know is that alcohol, as I mentioned before, is another macronutrient just primarily because of how many calories it supplies per gram. It's 7 calories per gram. But essentially all of those calories are empty. We don't get any other nutritional benefits from consuming alcohol, and so that's usually the first to go when we talk about reducing your calorie intake. So then if there are macronutrients, then there are micronutrients. And so micro just means small. So we do need vitamins, but we don't need them in as large a dose as the other nutrients. So vitamins, they don't give us any calories. So a mistake that some folks make when they're making changes to their intake is taking a whole bunch of extra supplements, thinking that that'll give them more energy through their day. Very commonly, I see people taking extra B12 beyond what their lab results would warrant, and and that's kind of a misnomer because we're not getting any calories or energy from the vitamins. They are helpful for the release of energy, but you have to eat food for that process to happen. So when someone does have a deficiency of a vitamin, that's different, and we usually are treating that appropriately. But thinking about that when you're tempted to take an extra supplement that's not needed. We want to make sure, though, that we're taking in the vitamins required for growth, for development, our metabolism, breaking down our food, and then just different other body processes. There's too long of a list to even list. But the types of vitamins there's two types. There are fat-soluble vitamins, such as vitamin A, vitamin D, E, and K. Then we have water-soluble vitamins, which would include B1, B12, vitamin C, etc. So when we talk about healthy cooking methods and pairing nutrients together, when we put, say, a healthy fat in place with food that's rich in vitamin A or K, that will be strategic in helping you absorb some of the vitamins from those foods. So micronutrients also include minerals, and they also do not provide any calories, but they're just as important for things such as forming the hardened parts of the body. So apart from muscle tissue of lean body mass, there's also bones and teeth, and those are also important. Keep us active, keep us going. We also want to take in the vitamins required for our nerve function, our cell function, our brain function, making decisions through the day about what we're doing, and concentration and things of that nature. So minerals are important with that. Examples of minerals include things like calcium, of course, for our bones and teeth. Iron can be a carrier in our bloodstream for oxygen through our body. Sodium and potassium can be important for our fluid balance, our hydration status throughout the day. And then magnesium can be important for things like muscle contractions and heart rhythm regulation and things. So all of those are examples. Then we have our phytochemicals, and these are kind of a relatively new researched nutrient class. So phyto, it just means from plants. So these are chemicals in plants that protect against diseases and pests and decay when they're growing in the ground. But in turn, when we consume these chemicals, these naturally occurring substances in plants, we're also getting disease preventative benefits. These phytochemicals, while they're not necessary for life, they're highly beneficial when we talk about all-encompassing, well-rounded wellness program. We want to include these phytochemicals. examples, if you think of the term antioxidant, you might be more familiar with that term, and that's just one type of phytochemical out there. Lycopene in tomatoes, very helpful in looking at prostate cancer risk level in men and reducing that. Lycopene can be very beneficial. Anthocyanins in berries and dark colored fruit, and then beta carotene in carrots, leafy greens, and a lot of these dark orange colored produce that we consume. It's helpful if we can to, we'll get a variety in of these nutrients the more varied we eat our produce. So instead of eating the exact same vegetable every single day, branching out and looking at different choices day to day, week to week, trying to get the most color on our plate as possible can ensure that you're getting a variety of these phytochemicals. With metabolism, going into that a little bit, the next step after learning about nutrients is learning how to eat them in a way that works with our metabolism, which is our ability to convert these calories we've just eaten into energy. So the bulk of our metabolism during the day is what's from our resting energy expenditure. It's really just the number of calories we're burning at rest to maintain our weight. And so in theory, if we were completely resting, like in bed all day long, and we ate that number of calories, we would be weight neutral. We wouldn't lose weight and we wouldn't gain weight. We'd stay the exact same weight. And so some factors that influence that rate, though, at rest would be things like that we may not be able to control, such as genetics, such as activity level, how much lean body mass that we have. Some elements of lean body mass we actually can control a little bit, such as muscle. We can't necessarily control, though, how tall we are, how much bone mass we have, so that includes that. But things that we can control would be maybe our eating frequency, which we'll talk about in more detail coming up. But when we think about our weight management program, it's helpful to focus on the things that we do have control over, rather than focus on these things that, like genetics, that we don't have as much control over when we're going through this. So to lose weight, we have to think about how many calories does it take to produce 1 pound of body weight. And so really when we talk about planning your meals, we're trying to create an energy gap. So a gap in between how many calories you burn versus how many calories you eat. If we can drop the amount of calories that you eat slightly, then over time, we're creating a bigger and bigger gap, which can accumulate and add up to 3,500 calories, which is when you see that pound of weight loss. So some guidelines for preserving a healthy metabolism, getting the most out of it possible, would be number 1, eating frequently through the day. If we think about an analogy here, it's sometimes good to think about a campfire. Like when we are putting logs on it continuously through the night, it's going to keep going through the whole night long. It's going to burn very bright, create the light, the heat, the energy. But if we sleep in, if we don't put any more logs on, eventually the fire will burn dimmer, and then finally it's just going to be going out on us. So it's not going to give us any more light and heat. We're just going to be cold. And so food is the same way. When we eat frequently through the day, it's like putting more logs on the fire that could keep our metabolism firing and burning steadily. When we skip our meals, the fire dies down and our metabolism can slow down with it. So that's important to remember. And so we're going to follow very specific guidelines, such as eating breakfast early enough and then eating on a schedule through the day to ensure that this metabolism fire is running properly for you. Okay, so fuel that fire. So, putting all of this knowledge into action here, we want to help plan healthy meals that will give us all of these beneficial nutrients that we just talked about. So, remembering first, we need our macronutrients through the day. So, we need protein, we need carbohydrates, and we need fats. And we ideally need them almost every meal. So, we usually recommend about 14 grams at least of protein at snack times or those smaller eating occasions through the day. That works out to about a 2-ounce portion of cooked lean protein if you're looking at that, or a higher protein dairy source would be another example of that. And then for main meals of the day, we're typically looking for between 3 to 4 ounces of cooked lean protein source, or the equivalent of foods. That's going to give you between 21 to 28 grams of protein. So, we want to pair our nutrients together. And so when you have your protein in your meal, you're not done yet. You also need to have a carbohydrate with it. So if we can get them from those complex sources, though, from your vegetables, your fruit, your high fiber starches, your whole grains, that's going to be the best thing to pair up with your protein. We recommend including some carbohydrate source at every meal and every snack. And the final nutrient we need are these healthy fats. And so even with the lean or the low fat protein foods, there's going to be a small amount of fat usually in each of those. So that gives us the majority of the fat that we truly need. So we're not looking at adding a whole bunch of extra fat to the rest of the day. We're usually targeting at least one serving of extra healthy fat every day. And these servings are small if you're looking at your Choose Your Foods book. A little bit goes a long way of them. So the goal for your day, and your dietitian, if you're looking at these numbers and wondering how to really make this happen, your dietitian that works with you is going to be mapping this out for you. But sometimes it's helpful to know where that's coming from. And so the goal is that we're getting almost 50% of our calories from healthy carbohydrate foods through the day, and then about a third of your calories from protein, and the remainder from your healthy fats. So one way of thinking when you're meal planning is getting dressed in the day. Just like we always need to put on some top and some bottom. So we need a shirt and our pants, and sometimes we need shoes. Not all the time. If we're walking around barefoot in the house, we don't always need shoes, but usually at least once a day we're putting our shoes on. And that's kind of what the same idea is of getting dressed. We always are going to need protein, which is like putting our shirt on. And we always need carbohydrates, which is like putting our pants on. And then sometimes we're going to need to add some fat to it, which would be the shoes that we wear. But that's also another reason we use this analogy is that it helps us remember the proportion of our calories distributed. So our pants are the biggest clothing item that we put on, and so that reminds us that we need a little bit more carbohydrates as part of the meal. The shirt is close to that, though, so that's the next nutrient in line. And finally, just as our shoes will cover the smallest section of our body, our added fat should be the smallest portion of food on our plate. Don't leave the house without your pants on. Just to remember how important those healthy complex carbohydrates are to our body. So if we think about it, when getting dressed, if we keep with that analogy, it doesn't get any easier than putting on a onesie. I mean, if we all could do that, how wonderful would that be? But it can be useful using this analogy because we think about meal replacements like this. They're a one-stop shop. They have everything already balanced in them if you choose the right brands that will provide you with the guidelines we're going to talk about, but they're convenient, they're portable, they give you all three macronutrients, sometimes even the micronutrients in them. And they can help with the eating frequency part that we talked about, fueling your fire and eating steadily through the day. When you're in a rush, in a pinch, sometimes it's so easy to just go grab one of these meal replacement choices. When you're looking at labels, the best way to tell if it's workable or not is to look at the calories, the protein, and then the carbohydrates. Because we're looking for calories, 160 to 200 to substitute one of your smaller meals versus snacks. And then for your protein grams, we're looking at 14 to 20 grams of protein on the product per serving. Lastly, 14 to 25 grams of carbohydrates. And if you notice that the carbs and the protein almost match each other, that's exactly what we're shooting for. We want your grams of carb and grams of protein to be, if not identical, within somewhat of a 5-gram range. So if the protein said 20, the carbs say 25, that's pretty close. Or if the carbs say 15, the protein says 20, that's also within 5 grams of each other. That's a really good balance of nutrients to consume. So when we meal plan, in addition to using these convenient options such as meal replacements, having a plan can be really, really vital to being successful with all of this. If we think about a typical busy day, if we try to remember, oh, I got to have my complex carb, my protein, sometimes a fat, every single opportunity we encounter food, if we have to remember that like 5 times, 7 times a week, 6 times a day, it can be really challenging. And sometimes we can just pull back right to our favorite go-tos and not really give too much thought about these things. So if we leave our food choices up to chance, it can be really impossible to follow consistently all of the guidelines. But if we actually set aside time each week to do the meal planning, to think about what meals are going to give us the nutrients that we need, then this all can fall into place. And so sometimes using a chart or a weekly calendar as a tool to plan your meals can be really valuable. Sometimes using an electronic app like a meal logging app can be really helpful. To plan it all in there, put it all in, see where you stand on your calories and your carb and protein and fats can be helpful. But in doing so, in meal planning, the steps to meal planning include thinking about first, where are these meals going to be coming from? How many meals in the week are you going to get from restaurants, from eating out, takeout, fast food, etc.? How many of them realistically are you envisioning preparing from scratch in the kitchen at home? How many are going to be just prepackaged items that are just grab and go? How many will be meal replacements? And then it helps you to narrow down and make a good grocery list from that, because you'll say, okay, breakfast 5 days a week is going to be a meal replacement. And then you'll think about dinner, 1 night a week we'll be eating out. And then a couple days a week I'm going to be doing a prepackaged meal for lunch. And so then it whittles down to see how many of the meals are you going to actually be cooking and preparing from scratch. So some helpful tips with all of this, making it a little easier for yourself. If you get smaller size containers and plates, that helps automatically portion control your food. If you also fill it up with extra produce from plants, a great thing would be 2/3 of your plate from plant foods, combinations of vegetables, whole grains, beans, etc. And then 1/3 of your plate would be a lean protein, whether it's from tempeh or whether it's from lean chicken, etc. That can be a very quick and simple way to visualize your plate. And then also controlling the variety. So sometimes when we have too many choices to pick from, too many things in the fridge, too many things in the pantry, our cart is too full in the grocery store. It's almost like that buffet effect where human nature kicks in and we want to try a little bit of everything because we feel we're going to be missing out on something if we don't eat a little bit of everything. So when we scale back the variety, though, and we have a little bit less to choose from, it simplifies things. It can be potentially less triggering to sift through, and we can just kind of get better into a more basic routine through the day. So if you start really basic, just two basic breakfasts that you know give your nutrients. You do two basic lunches, and then dinners, you might even just do two of those, and you can batch cook. And so if you cook one meal, you might get two dinners out of it, and etc. That might help make this a little bit more simple in the beginning. And then it's always safe to add variety by eating a very wide selection of non-starchy vegetables, fruit, even a few of those starchier vegetables. These give you the least amount of calories, but the most amount of nutrients. And so if you say have an extra cup of veggies on the plate, one particular meal, it's going to have negligible impact on the gap between your calories burned and calories eating. So it's going to really promote the weight management piece. We also want to eat several colors. Going back to the phytonutrient piece, when we have a lot of color from produce on our plate, first of all, visually that can be just very pleasant and satisfying to see. And we're also going to be getting a variety of those phytonutrients. Consolidate though when you can, and so if you think about trying to like cook every single different breakfast, lunch, and dinner and your snacks 5 times a day and then start over again the next day, well, that could be 35 different meals a week that you're cooking and spending a lot of time in the kitchen. So if you can consolidate and kind of cook in batches, maybe you're planning that week to make your healthy carbohydrate at dinner to be quinoa. And there's a lot of different ways you can take it with different herbs and spices and vegetables thrown in there. But you can cook up just your whole batch of quinoa, put it in containers, and then that way it's all done and ready for you. All you have to add is the other ingredients and seasonings to it. So we really encourage cooking things in batches when you can. Spending less time in the kitchen potentially that isn't needed. And then also using different spice blends and herbs to help minimize added salt and sugar and oil. Things are going to be adding calories, might stimulate you to overeat that meal. We want to get other nutrients are found also in spices and herbs. And so the more that you can season with them, the better. And then, but also just remembering to, it's okay to keep things very, very simple. So if you find a breakfast that works really well for you, it's okay to eat it every single day. You'll have variety in some of the other meals that you're eating. And so with some of the meals that you're doing, it's okay to really eat in a routine or a pattern like that. So a sample day might, for example, look like this. It might include, say, breakfast within an hour of waking up. Say you wake up at 6:30, so by 7 you're almost out the door. You can pull out a meal replacement drink and do it for breakfast. And then for snack, maybe you're going to be looking at a Greek yogurt and an apple. Some sort of a dairy and fruit together can work really well because we get our protein from our yogurt and we get our complex carb from our apple. So that could be another thing. And then by lunchtime, thinking about something that cooks up quick, something you could even cook ahead of time even and box up for the next day. something like 3 or 4 ounces of salmon with a nice big salad, lots of different veggies in the mix there, and then adding maybe a light yogurt, Greek yogurt based dressing that will give you some of the healthy fats to help you absorb some of those fat soluble nutrients from your greens. And then lastly, thinking about, or the second to last really, is if thinking about the mid-afternoon time. Sometimes that's when hunger can hit the strongest. Even potentially head hunger sometimes if we've had a long, stressful day. Better to go ahead right off the bat though and just plan for it. Have something easy to grab, something that you can plug in that gives you all of your nutrients for that eating time, like a meal replacement bar would be one example. Takes the edge off things before dinner too. So by dinner at 7, you're able to do your lean protein, your lots of veggies, maybe a complex carb like beans or lentils with that, and that can be just a really, really well-rounded meal example. If you notice, there aren't really big time gaps either in the schedule. That's strategic. Going back to fueling your metabolism, we want within every 3 or 4 hours eating something throughout the day steadily. So that's what we're looking for. So in conclusion, our food is made up of all of these macronutrients that give us our calories. So there are carbohydrates, remembering they're our energy source. And then we get our protein, which is a building block for our muscles, maintaining our lean body mass as we're losing weight, our organs and our cells. And then we're also taking in fat from these healthy plant sources. It helps promote satiety, that feeling of satisfaction after a meal or fullness. Helps with absorption of certain vitamins, protects our vital organs and insulates them, and that's kind of what we're getting from our food that we're eating. The micronutrients include vitamins and minerals. This is still necessary. They don't give us any calories though, and and they are important though. The more variety you get in your diet, the more of these micronutrients you'll take in. So just remembering too that we have to fuel this fire. So eating breakfast within an hour of waking up and then working your way through the day, planning to eat every 3 or 4 hours steadily. When planning your meals, always pair a lean protein with a healthy carbohydrate, and once or twice a day also adding those healthy fats from plant sources throughout the day. Remember back to the getting dressed analogy of the shirt being your protein, the pants being your carbohydrate, and the shoes being your healthy fats. Think about planning your meals like getting dressed in the morning. And then lastly is just to take time each week to do the meal planning, do the work, make a grocery list where everything on your list you've had a designated spot for, meaning that there aren't a whole bunch of extras floating into your cart, walking aisle by aisle to put different things in there, because what happens is you get home and then you have all of this extra food that either gets wasted or you might be tempted to overeat just to use it up and to kind of snack on it or graze on it. So better to go ahead, start with mapping out your meals and snacks, and then build your grocery list based off of the ingredients that you need to put these foods together. And this makes sure that you always have enough healthy, convenient food on hand, minimizing the need to rely on last minute fast food runs or takeout or vending machines or things like that. And so I'm just going to give you the opportunity just to review the homework from this section of your binder. So if you flip to the tab, which is your Knowing Nutrients tab, and then if you look at the kind of the second page into it where it says weekly activities, After you've completed this session, you'll be able to check off the first box, which is watching the webinar here. And then at the end of the webinar, there's actually a page in there that you can take some time to write any questions you have from the information we've gone over today, and follow up at a Q&A session or even one-on-one with your dietitian at your next visit. If it's something that you feel is of a more personal nature or something you'd just be more comfortable with asking moving forward, that would be an option as well. But it's really good to just write those out so you remember them. And then there's also a test your knowledge quiz. So by the end of this week, if you can actually take this quiz, it isn't very long. It's really just covering the basic information we've just talked about. So it's just for your own benefit to just see how much you've learned, and then there is the answer key at the end. So after you take it, you can kind of go through and see what ones you got right, and then any that you found that you were unsure about or maybe didn't get right away. That would be another question you could ask at the Q&A or ask your dietitian to review with you. And then there is another section in your binder on goal setting. And so if you look at the very end of that, it'll say small changes can make a large difference. And so some of the things that we talked about minimizing saturated fats from things like butter and full fat dairy, fattier cuts of meats, looking at ways to shift away from that, looking at ways to lower the simple carbs from the sugary items, and shifting to more complex carbohydrate options. So even if you picked like one or two changes on this checklist to start with today, that would be fantastic, because ultimately every change that you make will have a beneficial impact on your health. So if you can look through that. And then there are going to be some other assignments in the later weeks to come, things such as label reading, understanding how to read a food label and gather information from it to make a decision whether it's going to be goal promoting or moving you away from your goals. And there's also an option to do a food log for a week, which is also really helpful. You might end up taking it and doing what we talked about with meal planning with it, where you're actually just using it as a tool to map out your meals in advance. That can be one way of effectively tracking your food. And then that way, if you are eating something differently, you can just cross it out and change it and do that. So hopefully you feel like you've gotten a good foundation this week on nutrition basics that we can springboard from and help you with implementing in your everyday life. Thank you very much for attending this session, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.